Beeping was steady. That was the first thing I noticed. Not my son's voice, not his hand holding mine, just a machine, doing what machines do, keeping count of a heartbeat that nearly stopped while he was somewhere else entirely. I'm 68 years old. I've buried a husband, raised a child on my own, and sold the house I lived in for 31 years so I could start over somewhere smaller, somewhere quieter. I thought the hardest part of my life was already behind me. I was wrong. Let me tell you what happened. It was a Tuesday in October. I remember because I'd just gotten back from my weekly grocery run and the persimmons were finally in season. I bought 4 of them, which felt extravagant, but I figured I deserved it. I was carrying the second bag up the porch steps when my left foot caught the edge of the top step. The bag went one way, I went another. I don't remember hitting the ground. I remember the sky being very blue, and then I remember nothing. My neighbor, a retired school teacher named Opal who lives 2 doors down and walks her dog every morning at the same time. God bless her. She found me lying at the bottom of my own front steps with my groceries scattered across the walkway. She said the persimmons had rolled all the way to the sidewalk. She called 911. She rode with me in the ambulance. She held my hand in the emergency room even though she had her own doctor's appointment that afternoon that she quietly canceled without ever mentioning it to me until much later. I had a fractured wrist, 2 cracked ribs, and a moderate concussion. The doctor said I was lucky I hadn't hit my head on the concrete edge of the step. He said it the way doctors say things, matter-of-factly, like luck is a medical term. What he didn't say, but what I was already thinking as I lay there staring at the ceiling tiles was, where is my son? My son is 43 years old. His name is Philip, and he works in corporate finance in a city about 4 hours from where I live. He married a woman named Tara 8 years ago. She's pleasant enough in the way that certain people are pleasant, smooth on the surface, careful with words, never quite warm. I used to tell myself that Philip was just busy, that the months between phone calls were a product of his schedule, not his priorities, that when he forgot my birthday 2 years running, it was an oversight, not indifference. I was very good at telling myself those things. 68 years of practice. The hospital called his number at 11:14 in the morning. I know this because the nurse, a young man named Derek who had the kind of quiet competence that makes you trust someone immediately, he showed me the call log later when I asked. They called Philip at 11:14, then again at 11:31, then at 11:31, then at 11:35, then at 12:20, 12:48, and 1:15. 6 calls before I even regained full consciousness. He didn't answer a single one. I woke up properly around 2 in the afternoon. Opal was still there, sitting in the plastic chair beside my bed, reading a paperback she'd pulled from her purse. She looked up when I stirred, put her book down, and said, "There you are." Not, thank God, not I was so worried. Just there you are, like I'd stepped out for a moment and come back. I asked about Philip. She paused. Just a fraction of a second, but I've known Opal for 3 years, and I know what her pauses mean. She said the hospital was still trying to reach him. I nodded and looked at the ceiling again. They kept trying. By 5 o'clock that evening, the count was at 19 calls. I told them to stop. What I didn't know yet, what I wouldn't find out for another 2 days, was where Philip actually was when those calls came in. He and Tara had taken a long weekend trip to a resort in the Smoky Mountains. A friends group thing, apparently. 12 people, a rented property, catered meals. Philip had mentioned it to me briefly sometime in August. We're doing a thing with the Hargrove crowd in October, and I'd said that sounded nice. I found out about it the way I imagine a lot of people my age find out things about their adult children's lives, through photographs posted publicly on the internet. Tara had posted a video at 1008 in the afternoon, right between the hospital's 3rd and 4th attempts to reach my son, of herself on a wooden deck overlooking a mountain valley. There were autumn leaves, the kind that look almost fake. They're so beautiful. There was a glass of wine. There was my son in the background, laughing at something someone off camera had said. The caption said, "Exactly what we needed. 0 cell service, 0 stress, just mountains and good people." A 0 cell service. but the video posted at 1:08 in the afternoon. I looked at that caption for a long time. My daughter-in-law called me on Thursday morning, 2 days after the fall. By then I was home, because I'd insisted on going home even though the doctor wanted to keep me one more night. I'd spent enough time in that room. I wanted my own bed and my own quiet. Tara's call came at 9:47 a.m. She said she just heard that she was so sorry that Philip felt just terrible. She said they'd had almost no reception up in the mountains. It had been nearly impossible to reach anyone, and she said this in the smooth, practiced tone of someone who has already agreed on the story. I said, "Tara, I saw the video you posted on Tuesday afternoon." Silence. "The one on the deck," I said. "With the wine. You said 0 cell service, but videos don't post themselves." More silence. And then, "Well, we had some reception, but it was really spotty." 19 calls, I said, in 6 hours. Not one of them went to voicemail. She said she understood why I was upset. She said this was a really difficult situation and everyone needed time to process. She said Philip was going to call me soon. I thanked her for calling. I hung up. And then I sat at my kitchen table for a long time with my wrist in its brace and my ribs aching every time I breathed too deeply. And I thought about the kind of woman who will post a scenic video on a day her mother-in-law is lying unconscious in a hospital, and then explain it away with spotty reception. Philip called that evening. He sounded the way he always sounds when he knows he's done something wrong. Slightly impatient, as though my being upset is a problem he's being asked to solve. He apologized. He said it was complicated. He said the reception really had been bad for most of the trip. I asked him if he'd seen any of the 19 missed calls. He said he'd seen them when they got back into range Thursday morning. I said, "And you called me Thursday evening." He said he'd needed to process things, that it was a lot to take in, that he'd been worried about how to approach the conversation. I'm 68 years old. I fell down a flight of stairs and cracked 2 ribs and fractured my wrist and lay unconscious on my front walkway for long enough that my neighbor had time to find me, call emergency services, ride 4 miles to the hospital, and cancel her own afternoon appointment. And my son needed 2 days to process how to approach the conversation. I told him I was fine, that Opal had been wonderful, that the doctor said I'd make a full recovery. I told him not to worry. He sounded relieved. That's the part that has stayed with me. He sounded relieved. That's the part that has stayed with me. He sounded relieved. I want to be fair, so I'll say this. Philip was not always this way. When he was young, when it was just the 2 of us after his father passed, when money was tight and I worked 2 jobs and he figured out how to make macaroni and cheese on the nights I came home after 9, he was a tender kid. He felt things deeply. He wrote me a card once when he was maybe 12 that said, "You are the hardest working person I know, and I'm going to take care of you when I grow up." I still have that card. It's in the cedar box on my dresser. I don't know exactly when things shifted. I think it was gradual. I think it was Tara, not because she's a villain, but because she came with a worldview, her family's worldview, where people keep careful account of what they're owed and what they've given, and sentiment is something you feel privately but don't let interfere with decisions. I think Philip absorbed that over the years, the way you absorb any environment you live in long enough. But I also think, and this is harder to say, that I let it happen. I made excuses. I called less than I wanted to, so I wouldn't seem needy. I downplayed my loneliness. I told myself he was busy. He was building his life. I didn't want to be a burden. I was very careful not to be a burden. And somehow I ended up lying on a hospital bed with 19 unanswered calls and a neighbor holding my hand instead of my son. About 3 weeks after the fall, something happened that I hadn't expected. I have a financial planner, a woman I've worked with for several years who helped me manage the proceeds when I sold the house. There was a significant amount of money involved, and I'd been careful with it, invested conservatively, kept it liquid enough that I could draw from it if I needed to. She called me in November to check in, which she does periodically, and in the course of the conversation, she mentioned that Philip had reached out to her office. I asked her to repeat that. Philip had contacted her, not through me directly, to ask about my assets. He'd framed it as concerns, she said. He'd said he was worried about my ability to manage my own finances given my recent injury, and that he wanted to understand what safeguards were in place. She had declined to share any information correctly because I am her client and he is not. But she thought I should know. I thanked her. I hung up. I sat very still for about 5 minutes. Then I called my attorney. His name is Wallace. He's been my attorney for 11 years, handled my husband's estate, handled the house sale, patient and methodical and not easily rattled. I told him everything. The fall, the 19 calls, the conversation with Tara, the call from my financial planner. Wallace listened. When I finished, he said, "Do you want to wait and see how this develops, or do you want to act now?" I said I'd been waiting for a long time already. We spent 2 hours on the phone that afternoon. I won't detail everything we discussed because some of it is still ongoing, but I'll tell you the broad shape of it. I updated my documents. I restructured certain things. I made decisions that I should have made years ago, but kept deferring because I didn't want to think about what deferring meant. And I updated my will. There's a woman at my church, the small Episcopal congregation I've attended for the past 2 years since moving here, whose name is June. She's in her late 30s, a single mother, came to this country from the Philippines when she was 19. She works 2 jobs. She has a daughter in middle school named Rosa, who is one of the most quietly remarkable children I've ever met. June started bringing me soup after the fall. Just showed up one Saturday morning with a container of chicken arroz caldo, knocked on the door, said she'd heard what happened and wanted to help. She came back the following Saturday with lugaw. She offered to drive me to my follow-up appointments when my wrist was still too sore to manage the steering wheel comfortably. She did all of this without ever making me feel like a charity case, which is a gift not everyone has. I started helping Rosa with her reading on Tuesday afternoons. She wants to be a marine biologist. She has a notebook full of drawings of fish she's researched, not traced, drawn from memory after studying photographs. She shows it to me sometimes, very casually, like it's nothing, the way children show you their most precious things. I don't have grandchildren. I used to think that was a grief I'd carried alone. Sitting across from Rosa at my kitchen table while she practices her vocabulary words, I think about what it means to choose your family. Not in a greeting card way, in a real, practical way. Who shows up? Who sits with you in the hospital? Who brings soup? Who holds your hand? Philip called in December. He was friendly, chatty, full of news about a project at work and plans for the holidays. He mentioned, almost in passing, that he and Tara might not make it for Christmas, something about her family's schedule, which changes every year. He said maybe they'd try to visit in the spring. I said that sounded fine. He said he hoped I wasn't still upset about the October thing. He said he wished I could understand how hard it was to be so far away and feel helpless when something happens. I thought about 19 calls. I thought about a video posted at 1008 in the afternoon. I thought about spotty reception. I said, "I understand exactly how you feel, Philip." And then we talked about other things, and eventually we said goodbye. And when I hung up, I sat quietly for a moment and felt something settle in me. Not bitterness, not quite, but a kind of clarity. The kind you get when you finally stop explaining something to someone who has already decided not to hear it. I want to tell you what I did with the money. When I sold the house, the proceeds came to a little over $200,000 after everything was settled. I had been keeping it largely untouched, in a conservative portfolio because I wasn't sure what I needed yet. I wasn't sure what my future looked like. After November, I got clearer. I put $60,000 to an annuity that will cover my basic living expenses indefinitely. I kept $40,000 as accessible savings for repairs, emergencies, the unexpected, which I now know to plan for more carefully. I donated $30,000 to a scholarship fund at the community college here, something I'd thought about for years but kept putting off. I set aside $20,000 specifically for Rosa's education, held in trust with June's knowledge and consent. And I updated my will so that the remainder of my estate, My possessions, whatever savings exist at the time, whatever else I've accumulated, goes to causes and people that reflect the life I'm actually living, not the life I thought I had. Philip is not in it. That's not a punishment. I want to be clear about that because I've thought about it carefully, and I don't want to be someone who acts from spite. It's more like an accounting of presence, of who was there when 19 calls went unanswered, of who brought soup on a Saturday morning without being asked, of who sits across my kitchen table on Tuesday afternoons and shows me drawings of fish. I'm 68 years old. I have maybe 20 good years left if I'm careful and lucky. I intend to spend them with people who show up. Opal and I have breakfast together most Sundays now. She brings the newspaper. She still gets it delivered in print, which I love, and I make the coffee and we sit on my porch when the weather permits and argue gently about things we read and talk about our weeks, and sometimes just sit in comfortable silence, which is its own kind of luxury. She told me once, a few months after the fall, that she hadn't even thought twice about canceling her appointment that day. She said she'd just done what seemed obvious. I told her it hadn't felt obvious to me. I told her I was used to managing on my own. She looked at me over her coffee cup and said, "That's the saddest thing I've ever heard you say." I thought about that for a long time afterward. I think she was right. I don't know if Philip will ever understand what those 2 days cost. Not me. I've made my peace with it, or I'm in the process of making it, which is the most any of us can do. But what it cost him, what he gave away without even realizing by being on a mountain deck with a glass of something amber-colored while his mother lay unconscious on a concrete walkway. You don't get those calls back. You don't get a do-over on the moments when someone needed you and you weren't there. You can apologize. You can explain. You can tell yourself the reception was spotty. But the 19 calls are still there, logged in a hospital system somewhere, time-stamped and unanswered, and nothing changes that. I'm not angry anymore. I moved through the anger in November, sitting at my kitchen table with my wrist in a brace, and came out the other side into something quieter, something that felt, oddly, like freedom. I fell down my own front steps on a Tuesday in October. My neighbor found me. A nurse named Derek made 6 calls and then 19 more, and somewhere in the Smoky Mountains, a video posted itself to the internet while the leaves turned orange and gold. And now it's spring. Opal and I had breakfast this morning. Rosa showed me a new page in her fish notebook, a cuttlefish rendered in pencil with extraordinary detail, labeled in her careful handwriting. I made extra coffee. The persimmons won't be back until fall, but I'm already looking forward to them. Some things are worth waiting for, and some things, it turns out, are not. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since October, not in an abstract way, in a very specific, unglamorous way you think about things when you're sitting at your kitchen table with a fractured wrist and 2 cracked ribs and the sudden clarifying knowledge that the person you raised chose a mountain resort over 19 unanswered calls. There's a version of this story where I spend the rest of my life bitter about that. I understand the pull of that version. It's easier in some ways. It has a clear villain, a clear wound, a clear reason for everything that went wrong. But I've lived long enough to know that bitterness is just grief that didn't finish its work. And I had work to do. What I've come to believe, not because anyone taught it to me, but because I watched it play out slowly over decades, is that the life you build is mostly a record of what you showed up for. That's it. That's the whole ledger. Every time you cancel something important for something convenient, every time you let a call go to voicemail because the timing isn't ideal, every time you choose the easier version of yourself over the harder one, it accumulates, not as punishment, just as consequence, the natural result of a pattern you practiced long enough that it became who you are. Philip didn't become the man who didn't answer 19 calls in a single afternoon. He became that man slowly, one small abdication at a time, over years. I watched it happen and told myself it was busyness, it was distance, it was the natural drift between parents and adult children. I was being generous, I thought. I was giving him room. What I was actually doing was refusing to see clearly, because seeing clearly would have required me to grieve something I wasn't ready to grieve. The intelligence I'm talking about. the kind that actually serves you in a life, isn't the kind that gets you a corporate job or a good portfolio. It's the kind that lets you look at a situation honestly, without flinching. It's the kind that Opal had when she canceled her appointment without making a production of it because she understood intuitively what the moment required. It's the kind that June has when she shows up on a Saturday morning with soup for a neighbor she barely knows because she was raised to understand that showing up is not optional. It's the baseline. Rosa has it too, in the early form that children carry before the world either sharpens it or wears it down. She draws those fish from memory because she looked at them carefully first. That's the whole skill, really. Looking carefully. At the world, at the people around you, at yourself. I was not always good at it. I looked away from Philip for years because looking hurt, and I paid for that in the specific, irreversible currency of a hospital room where the chair beside my bed held my neighbor instead of my son. But here's what I want to say about resilience, because I think we misunderstand it. It's not toughness. It's not pretending things don't hurt. It's the willingness to be changed by what happens to you without being destroyed by it. I was changed by October, by November, by the phone call from my financial planner, by the conversation with Wallace, by every Saturday morning with June and every Tuesday afternoon with Rosa. I am not the same woman who bought 4 persimmons because she felt like being a little extravagant. I'm someone quieter and, I think, more honest. The choices I made, the will, the annuity, the scholarship, the trust for Rosa's education, those weren't revenge. They were accuracy. A true accounting of what I value and who has shown up to value it with me. That's not a punishment for Philip. It's just the ledger, finally balanced. I don't know if he'll understand that someday. I've stopped waiting to find out. What I know is that Opal will be here Sunday with the newspaper, and Rosa will come Tuesday with her notebook, and June will probably bring something in a container that smells extraordinary, and I will make the coffee. That is enough. It is, I've decided, more than enough.